Julian Lombardi was a man who thrived on control. Every detail of his life was meticulously planned, from his business meetings to the way his household was run. As a self-made millionaire, he prided himself on his ability to maintain order and precision in all things. But one afternoon, as he strolled through the lush garden of his estate, he stumbled upon a scene that disrupted his carefully curated world. There, under the shade of an old oak tree, his son Leonardo was dancing with Isabella, the family's cook. Julian froze, watching as Leonardo moved with a grace he had never seen before. The boy's face was lit with a rare smile, one that Julian hadn't witnessed in years. Isabella, her hands gently guiding Leonardo's movements, seemed to be teaching him steps with a patience and warmth that Julian found both surprising and unsettling. For a moment, Julian stood there, unnoticed, his mind racing. Why was his son, who had been so withdrawn since the death of his mother, suddenly so animated? And who was this woman, this cook, to have such an effect on him? The sight left Julian with a strange mix of emotions, shock, curiosity, and an unshakable sense of unease. Leonardo had changed after his mother's passing. Once a lively and curious child, he had become quiet and reserved, retreating into a shell that even Julian's wealth and influence couldn't penetrate. Julian had tried to provide for his son in every material way possible, but the emotional distance between them had only grown. Before we continue, be sure to subscribe to our channel and like this video to show your support. That afternoon in the garden, however, Julian saw a side of Leonardo he thought was lost forever. The boy's laughter echoed through the air as he stumbled over a step, only to be gently corrected by Isabella. Her encouragement was soft but firm, and Leonardo responded with a determination that Julian hadn't seen in years. Julian couldn't help but notice how Isabella's presence seemed to bring out the best in his son. She wasn't just teaching him to dance, she was giving him something far more valuable: joy. Yet, as Julian watched, a knot of discomfort tightened in his chest. He felt a pang of guilt for not being the one to bring that light back into Leonardo's life, and a growing suspicion about Isabella's intentions. Unable to ignore what he had seen, Julian approached Isabella and Leonardo later that evening. His tone was firm, almost accusatory, as he demanded to know what they were doing. Leonardo, caught off guard, hesitated before admitting that he had asked Isabella to teach him how to dance. "I've always wanted to learn," Leonardo said quietly, avoiding his father's gaze. "But I didn't think you'd approve." Isabella stepped in, her voice calm but resolute. "He needed someone to guide him," she explained. "And I thought it might help him find some happiness." Julian's initial irritation was tempered by a flicker of guilt. He hadn't realized how much Leonardo had been struggling, nor had he considered that something as simple as dancing could make such a difference. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to Isabella's story. "We'll discuss this later," Julian said, his tone leaving no room for argument. He waited until Leonardo had left the room before turning to Isabella. "Who are you, really?" he asked, his voice low. "And why are you so invested in my son?" Isabella met his gaze without flinching, but Julian could see a flicker of something in her eyes, sadness, perhaps, or regret. "I'm just someone who wants to help," she said simply. Julian wasn't satisfied. He decided to dig deeper, determined to uncover the truth about the woman who had so easily earned his son's trust. Julian's investigation into Isabella's past began discreetly. He hired a private investigator, who quickly uncovered a surprising detail: Isabella had once been a celebrated ballerina. A decade ago, her name had been synonymous with grace and talent, but she had vanished from the stage abruptly, leaving behind no explanation. The investigator provided Julian with an old newspaper article, its headline proclaiming Isabella as a rising star in the world of dance. The accompanying photograph showed a younger Isabella, radiant and full of life, a stark contrast to the quiet, reserved woman who now worked in his kitchen. Armed with this information, Julian confronted Isabella. He handed her the article, watching closely for her reaction. For a moment, she said nothing, her eyes fixed on the faded image of her former self. Then, with a sigh, she began to speak. "I was a ballerina," she admitted. "But that life is behind me now." Julian pressed her for more details, and reluctantly, Isabella shared her story. She had been engaged to a fellow dancer, a man she had loved deeply. But tragedy struck when he was killed in a car accident, leaving her heartbroken and lost. The pain had been too much to bear, and she had walked away from the stage, leaving behind the only life she had ever known. "Dancing with Leonardo reminded me of why I fell in love with it in the first place," she said softly. "He's so much like my fiancé was, full of potential, but unsure of himself. I just wanted to help him find his way." Julian listened in silence, his initial suspicion giving way to a grudging respect. Isabella's past explained her connection to Leonardo, but it also raised new questions. Could he trust her? And more importantly, could he trust himself to do what was best for his son? As the conversation ended, Julian felt the weight of his own shortcomings pressing down on him. He had spent so much time building his empire that he had neglected the one thing that truly mattered, his son. And now, a woman he barely knew had stepped in to fill the void he had left behind. Julian sat alone in his study long after his conversation with Isabella, the weight of her words settling heavily on his shoulders. He had always prided himself on being a provider, a man who could give his son everything money could buy. But as he replayed the image of Leonardo dancing in the garden, he realized how much he had failed to give him the one thing that truly mattered, his time and attention. Leonardo had been drifting further away since the death of his mother, and Julian had been too preoccupied with his business to notice. He had assumed that material comforts would be enough, but now he saw how wrong he had been. Isabella, a woman he had barely acknowledged, had done more for his son in a few weeks than he had in years. Julian felt a pang of guilt, but also a growing sense of determination. He couldn't change the past, but he could change the way he approached the future. For the first time in a long time, he allowed himself to think about what Leonardo truly needed, not just a father who provided, but one who was present. A few weeks later, Leonardo approached Julian with a request that took him by surprise. "I want to compete in the regional dance tournament," Leonardo said, his voice steady but his eyes betraying his nervousness. Julian hesitated. The idea of his son performing in front of an audience was far outside his comfort zone. He had always envisioned Leonardo following in his footsteps, taking over the family business one day. Dancing seemed frivolous, impractical. But as he looked at his son's determined expression, he realized that this was about more than just dancing. "If this is what you really want," Julian said slowly, "then I'll support you." Leonardo's face lit up with relief and gratitude. Isabella, who had been quietly standing nearby, offered to continue coaching him. Julian agreed, though he couldn't shake the feeling that he was stepping into uncharted territory. As the days passed, Julian watched as Leonardo threw himself into his training. The boy's confidence grew with each session, and Julian found himself drawn to the studio more often, observing from the sidelines. He saw how Isabella pushed Leonardo to improve while also encouraging him to enjoy the process. It was a delicate balance, one that Julian couldn't help but admire. As the tournament drew closer, Leonardo's excitement was tempered by a new challenge. He learned about Santiago, a seasoned dancer who had won the competition the previous year. Santiago was confident, almost arrogant, and he made no secret of his belief that Leonardo didn't stand a chance. "He's just trying to get into your head," Isabella told Leonardo during one of their training sessions. "Don't let him." Julian, who had been listening from the corner of the room, stepped forward. "Santiago sees you as a threat," he said to his son. "That's why he's trying to intimidate you. But you're stronger than he thinks." Leonardo nodded, but Julian could see the doubt in his eyes. Later that evening, Julian sat down with his son and shared a story from his own past, a time when he had been underestimated and how he had used that as motivation to prove his critics wrong. "You don't have to win to prove yourself," Julian said. "Just show them what you're capable of." Leonardo took his father's words to heart, and over the next few days, his determination only grew. He practiced tirelessly, pushing himself to perfect every step and movement. Julian watched with a mixture of pride and anxiety, realizing just how much this meant to his son. The day of the tournament arrived, and the atmosphere backstage was electric. Dancers stretched and warmed up, their nerves palpable. Leonardo stood quietly in a corner, his face pale but determined. Isabella was by his side, offering quiet words of encouragement. Julian, who had never been one for public displays of emotion, found himself feeling unusually anxious. He wanted nothing more than for Leonardo to succeed, not for the sake of winning, but for the confidence it would give him. When Leonardo's name was called, Julian held his breath as his son stepped onto the stage. The spotlight illuminated Leonardo's face, and for a moment, he looked out at the audience, his expression unreadable. Then the music began, and he started to move. It was as if the entire world faded away. Leonardo danced with a passion and precision that left the audience spellbound. Every step, every gesture, was filled with emotion, telling a story that words could never convey. Julian felt a lump form in his throat as he watched, realizing just how much his son had grown. Isabella stood beside Julian, her eyes glistening with tears. "He's doing it," she whispered. And he was. Despite the pressure, despite the doubts, Leonardo was giving the performance of his life. As the music reached its crescendo, Julian felt a surge of pride unlike anything he had ever experienced. This was his son, not the quiet, withdrawn boy he had known, but a young man who had found his voice through dance. When the music ended, the audience erupted into applause. Leonardo stood center stage, breathing heavily but smiling. Julian clapped along with the rest, his heart swelling with a mixture of relief and joy. Backstage, Julian embraced his son, something he hadn't done in years. "I'm proud of you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. Leonardo smiled, his eyes shining. "Thanks, Dad." In that moment, Julian realized that this wasn't just about a dance tournament. It was about Leonardo finding himself, and about Julian learning to be the father his son needed. And as he looked at Isabella, who was quietly watching from a distance, he felt a newfound respect for the woman who had helped make it all possible. The results of the tournament were announced shortly after the performances concluded. Leonardo didn't take first place, but he was awarded a special prize for artistic expression. The judges praised his emotional depth and unique style, noting that his performance had been a standout moment of the evening. Santiago, the reigning champion, approached Leonardo backstage. His earlier arrogance was gone, replaced by a grudging respect. "You're better than I thought," he admitted, extending a hand. "Next year, I won't underestimate you." Leonardo shook his hand, a quiet confidence in his demeanor. "Next year, I'll be ready," he replied. Julian watched the exchange with a mixture of pride and relief. He had been prepared for disappointment, but seeing Leonardo hold his own against someone like Santiago was more than he had hoped for. Isabella stood nearby, her face glowing with quiet satisfaction. As they left the venue, Leonardo clutched his medal tightly, not as a symbol of victory, but as a reminder of how far he had come. "I didn't win," he said to Julian, "but I feel like I did something even more important." Julian nodded, understanding. "You proved something to yourself," he said. "And that's worth more than any trophy." In the days that followed, something shifted in the Lombardi household. Julian, who had always been distant and preoccupied, began to take a more active interest in Leonardo's life. He asked about his training, attended his practices, and even offered to help in ways he hadn't before. One evening, as they sat together in the garden, Leonardo turned to his father. "Do you think I can keep training?" he asked. "I know it's not what you had planned for me, but it's what I want to do." Julian looked at his son, seeing not just the boy he had raised, but the young man he was becoming. "Of course," he said, a rare smile spreading across his face. "We're just getting started." Leonardo's eyes lit up, and for the first time in years, Julian felt a genuine connection with his son. It wasn't just about dancing, it was about supporting Leonardo in pursuing his passions, whatever they might be. Isabella, too, became a more integral part of their lives. Julian no longer saw her as just an employee, but as someone who had played a crucial role in helping Leonardo find his way. He thanked her one evening, his gratitude sincere. "You've done more for him than I ever could," Julian said. "I won't forget that." Isabella smiled softly. "He's a remarkable young man," she replied. "It's been a privilege to help him." Julian sat alone in his study one night, reflecting on everything that had happened. The sight of Leonardo dancing in the garden, the tournament, the conversations with Isabella, it all played like a film in his mind. He realized how much he had missed by focusing solely on his work and his need for control. He thought about the life he had built, the success he had achieved, and the price he had paid for it. For years, he had measured his worth by his accomplishments, but now he saw that true success wasn't about wealth or power. It was about the connections he had with the people who mattered most. Leonardo's journey had taught him that. It had shown him the importance of being present, of listening, and of allowing others to follow their own paths. Julian knew he couldn't change the past, but he was determined to make the most of the future. As he looked out the window at the garden where it had all begun, Julian felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. The rigid structure of his life had been disrupted, but in its place, something far more meaningful had emerged. He thought about Isabella and the way she had quietly changed their lives. She had brought light back into Leonardo's world and, in doing so, had reminded Julian of what truly mattered. The next morning, Julian joined Leonardo and Isabella in the garden. The three of them stood together, the morning sun casting a warm glow over the estate. Julian felt a sense of hope, a belief that they were on the brink of something new and beautiful. "Thank you," he said to Isabella, his voice sincere. "For everything." She nodded, her eyes reflecting the same hope he felt. As Julian watched Leonardo laugh and talk with Isabella, he realized that this was just the beginning. The journey ahead would be different from anything he had planned, but for the first time, he was ready to embrace the unknown. Nothing would ever be the same, and that was exactly how it should be. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and like this video to show your support.